This is The Art of Startup War, and I am your sensei, Brian McMahon. Now, in Season 1 and 2, I got inside the minds of startup investors. In Season 3, I brought in entrepreneurs to share their startup journey. Here, in Season 4, we combine both, so you can hear investors critique the investment value proposition of individual companies. You're going to hear how investors make decisions to invest in startups, what makes a great entrepreneur, and how billion-dollar companies are built. So tune in every Tuesday, 10 a.m. on all the major platforms. You can empower your tribe by sharing the podcast, and remember to subscribe, rate, review, and leave us a comment. Good morning, it is Brian. We are back on The Art of Startup War. I have, for the first time ever, we have never done this before we had this incredible podcast with Dr. Szilard Voros, and we spoke about his great company at the time, which was G3. And I had this flurry of people who were just so interested in it because it spoke to genomics and it spoke to the fact that we all have these 6 billion letters in our body. And he taught me more about the biology of the body and predictive thinking to stop bad stuff happening to us by being able to map out what our future could look like. And I always remember, when we did that podcast, Dr. Voros spoke so much about if you can properly map out the way you're supposed to live by looking at the things that you have the highest probability of getting and then avoiding that through the behaviors that you can then carry through your life, then you get back that 20 years that are stolen from you before. And we had so many people who called in after that podcast and emailed me, and that we connected with Dr. Voros, and everybody said, great, let's do this. And then this happened, which is this terrible coronavirus that has come and has hit our planet. And within seconds, Szilard, you were on the phone to me saying, I need to do something to not only prove out everything we'd spoken about before, but really to save the planet. So welcome back onto the podcast for the first time ever. We've never done it before. My good friend, Mr. Szilard Voros, welcome.
Well, thank you, Brian. And it is awesome to be back. Wish the circumstances were different. But listen, we have been working around the clock to tackle this deal. And it's great to speak with you. And we have a lot that we need to talk about, a lot that we need to share with the world.
We do. And I remember when you first came back in, you're like, here's what we need. Pure and simple. We need to be able to create a DNA susceptibility test so that we can work out which folks have got a higher probability of catching the virus, because that's perfectly obvious to everyone right now. Which folks should be going back to work? Which folks should be getting the actual vaccines first? And then we need to tie that into treatment options. So because this is such an important topic that you're covering, I want to just go straight into that and let you talk about that for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. And, tying back into our previous conversation, there's really two things I would like to point out, and then we'll talk about the susceptibility. One is that what we're doing is we're all about extending life and extending the healthy lifespan. And we talked about there are two types of big things that come against us. One, the internal diseases that we get, the heart disease, the diabetes, the Parkinson's, the Alzheimer's. And the other bucket are the threats from the outside, like the coronaviruses of the world. And obviously, this time we are now focusing on the external, because that's where the battlefield is today. That's exactly where we're going. The second point I wanted to make is that one of the ginormous advantages of the platform that we have is that at my company, G3Therapeutics, over the past 7 years, we have collected the data already. We have put the platform together already, and we've mapped out every single gene in the human body already. And all we're doing now is we're looking at that data, and we don't have to go out and now start a research project to do this. We already have the data to actually tackle some of these critical aspects. So that is why what we have is so transformational.
And just to be clear with everybody listening, we're not talking about a bunch of data that was thrown on a couple of spreadsheets. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars and years of research that pulls together the most conclusive data set that is currently on the planet.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so now there are two very important areas that we are working on. One, we are working on being able to identify people who are either super susceptible to get infected or super resistant to the infection. And the second piece we're working on, of course, is some of the potential treatment options. But let's talk about the first one. So Brian, here is the context. You have heard about it. Most people have heard about the Princess Diamond cruise ship. And there were thousands of people on that ship.
Yeah.
And the exposure to the virus was enormous. And about 20% of the passengers got sick. Not 50%, not 100%. So we know that there are some people who are inherently resistant to the virus. They were exposed, but for some reason, there's something inside their body, probably in their genetic makeup, that makes them resistant to the virus. So think about this. Right now, we have two really incredible global threats. We have the threat of the pandemic itself, right? And all of us are thinking about, are we going to get sick? We're thinking about all the people we love, all the people we care about, all the people in the world. Are they going to get sick? And that's one concern. The other concern is the indirect consequences, what's happening to the economy. The economy is collapsing now because none of us are at work. We're all sitting at home. Of course, we're at work working on this.
No, it's dying.
But
it's dying.
It's
Look,
dying.
In the startup world, I am seeing it. I saw it on the second day with the first company going bankrupt. It is the saddest and most terrible thing imaginable because it's something that people feel that they could have within their control, but this has snatched that away from them. So yes, it is a war on two fronts.
It is a war on two fronts. And think about this. Think about this. If tomorrow I had a test, I can take your blood or I can take your saliva, make you spit in a cup, do my test, and I was able to tell you, Brian, you are so lucky because you were born with this particular genetic variant and you are resistant to the virus.
Wow.
Well, guess what? I will send you back out.
Go to work.
The Ubers, drive the taxis, go open the restaurants.
Yeah.
I will send you to work. And what I can tell you is just based on the Princess Diamond cruise ship example, it is very, very likely that there are factors that make somebody resistant to the virus. Do I know that 100% for sure? Not yet, but it's very highly likely. But there's one thing I can tell you with 100% certainty. There's one thing I can tell you with 100% certainty. If there are genetic factors that make somebody resistant, we can and will find that.
And the other thing that I'm saying, now you're a cardiologist, so you're saying everything from a very medical perspective, but even from a human perspective, I'm watching the news yesterday evening and I'm reading the terrible story about the 26 doctors that have died in a hospital treating these people coming through. And even if we don't know for 100% that I am guaranteed never to get it, then we know to a high probability that it's highly unlikely I'm going to get it, especially using that the cruise line example that you used right there. So if we're just randomly putting every doctor into the hospital, whether they have a high susceptibility of catching it or a low one, then we're sending people to die, really, without even trying this. We're sending people to die, and that we know for a fact. So this is so enormous and so urgent because the vaccine's going to take time. We're not going to have drugs next week or next month to suddenly be able to solve this crisis. We see the hospitals, the beds we've run out of, the cruise ship beds we're going to run out of pretty soon. Everything else is going to end up disappearing. Like, there's no way back. So we have to be able to do something in the meantime to be able to mitigate the challenges that we're facing. So how difficult is it for you to develop what we're talking about here? And how long will it take?
That's remarkable, right? It really does not take that long, right? So conceptually, all we need, right, is we need to study people who are infected, who were exposed, and we need to study people who were not infected. And we believe that once we have that sort of information on a few hundred people, 500, 600, 800, 1,000, something in that range, we will have very significant insights into this, Brian. And depending on how effective we can be with our project, we can have that answer within the next 8 to 12 weeks. And does this sound like an eternity right now? Yes, it does. But at the same time, just like you said, this issue is not going away. Right before I got on this,
8 weeks from when this first came out would be pretty much today. So it's a tiny amount of time. It's just a question of actually getting this started, right?
Absolutely. And, right before I got on this podcast with you, I was working with a part of my team, and one of our advisors is someone who I can't say who they are, but they're one of the most well-renowned virologists in the world, and they had a pivotal role in developing the hepatitis C drug that effectively eradicated hepatitis C from the face of the earth. And I was speaking with him about what we're working on, and he was saying that, listen, yes, we will see an increase in the cases, then we will see a decrease in the cases. He is very concerned that by the fall there may be a second wave that will be coming back.
Right.
And then the other thing that he was mentioning is that, first of all, a vaccine is a long time from now. The other issue is that in order to be able to deploy the vaccine at such a global scale in such a short period of time from a safety testing perspective, and here's the deal, right? So yes, this coronavirus, COVID-19, is a terrible disease. If you look at it from an epidemiology perspective, the majority of the patients, still 80% of the people who get it, still only have mild symptoms. So what you have, Brian, in that situation is that, okay, 80% of the people have mild symptoms, and only 20% have severe symptoms, only 5% end up in the ICU. The mortality rate is, let's say, 2 to 3%. In that scenario, a vaccine has to be incredibly safe to deploy that at a range, because you have a disease where 80% of the people just have a mild cold.
Right.
So
you're saying it could make it worse if it's not done properly.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And so to get that kind of testing, it takes a long time. And then you have to really figure out, who do you give the vaccine to? And that's what we're trying to, if we have the susceptibility test in my hands, we would then prioritize the people who are particularly susceptible in terms of the immunization, and the other ones will at least initially not get the vaccine.
Yeah.
So it has enormous public health implications.
And then when we're looking at the drug development, it was something we really spoke about in the podcast for the G3 podcast. And if anybody's interested, and you should be, go back and listen to that first podcast where we discussed about the challenges with it taking 10 to 12 years to develop drugs, and all of the trials that we have to go through to develop drugs. And even though the FDA and the other health organizations globally have reduced down some of the barriers for those trials, it hasn't fixed the fundamental problem, which is that whenever we have a challenge, it should not take years to come up with drugs to deal with that. So I think there's a larger opportunity here, which is to really look at the entire drug development process and see how we can hack that and become a lot smarter with who we're actually developing drugs for and making it more curated.
That's exactly right. So that's why for us, as you know, and we talked about this in the previous podcast, is for us, drug development and testing goes hand in hand. And we develop the right drug for the right patient based on testing, very specific testing. And that's exactly what we're doing here. And it may not be a bad idea just to give you kind of a general idea how we as the field are tackling the coronavirus. And there's really two big angles at which we're coming at this disease from. One is that we're attacking the virus itself. That's what the so-called antiviral therapies do. That's a drug that comes in and actually tries to kill the virus itself. The other angle we can take, and we are taking, is that for the virus to actually infect a human, it has to get inside our cells. And turns out, as strange as it sounds, it's our own proteins, our own human proteins, that are actually the gateway for the virus to get inside the cell. So that's good and bad. And I'm thinking, I use the analogy that when a bank robber is trying to get into the bank, there's two ways we can try to stop that. One, we can try to catch the banker on the outside of the bank. That's what an antiviral drug does. Or we can blockade the entrance. And that's what we are doing, is we're working on the human proteins that are actually pulling the virus inside the cell. We're trying to shut that down. And that's what we're working on. And since that's a human protein, that's part of that platform that we had built over the past 7 or 8 years at G3Therapeutics. It's so easy for us. As soon as this virus popped up, we were able to start the work immediately because we already had the data.
And what comes next?
Well, the hard work is ahead of us. You know, we're working on these two projects parallel. We're working on the testing side. How do we identify people resistant and who are susceptible? And then there's a drug development piece. I tell you, the biggest breakthrough, Brian, would be if we were able to find, you mentioned the FDA process, but to shortcut the FDA process is to be able, and I'm not saying that from a negative, I'm saying that from a positive perspective. I'm not saying go around the FDA process. I'm saying to shortcut the time is that if we were able to find the drug, which is FDA approved today for a different disease, that we can find that that drug happens to have activity in this coronavirus situation, then the whole safety evaluation would be will have been done. So what we're working on right now, and thousands of researchers, by the way, working together on this, is to find potential drugs on the market which have activity against the virus. And I will say, I have never seen the science community and the biotechnology community so incredibly mobilized around one single goal. And that's why I'm so hopeful that within the next few weeks and months, we will have significant breakthroughs.
Yeah, and we are seeing it, by the way, in different areas. I remember on the news the other day, I mean, to laugh, but President Trump said, "Yep, I think we've got a cure," and he may have said that a tiny bit too fast. And then, but then we are seeing on kind of a more serious level, a lot of the specialists, a lot of the researchers who are coming out and saying, "Yes, there was this drug which was originally for cancer, but actually there are certain indications which can possibly help us on this," and even the lay person is now seeing all of the different places that folks are trying to come up with solutions. So that's one way you can do it. And then what can you do in the meantime? How do you start working on these 500 people to start seeing which one has got a higher or a lower susceptibility?
So what we are doing at the moment is that we are working with laboratories and doctors' offices who are seeing these patients and who are testing these patients. And when I say testing, with the diagnostic test, which says, do you have the virus or not if you have symptoms? So we are now putting together those efforts to actually work with these testing centers, mobile testing centers, laboratories, and doctors' offices. And we are in the process of the sample collection, collecting the swabs from these patients as well as the DNA. So that's what we're doing at the moment. And then as soon as we have sufficient number of those samples, then we will go through the DNA analysis and some of the analysis of the data. But the good news is that since these are genetic tests that we hope to get out of these, those can be put on existing FDA-approved platforms. And so as soon as the science is done, which we anticipate, like I said, maybe 8 to 12 weeks, then we should be able to push these out to the front lines very quickly.
Wow. And then, so how hard is it to be able to tell, though, like who is resistant and who is not? I mean, how do you know that they've potentially caught it and they were resistant, as opposed to just being on the cruise ship and not having touched anything that would have given it to them?
Yeah, so some of it is statistical analysis. So that's kind of what our scientific study design and protocol kind of takes that into consideration. So we kind of have to make statistical assumptions around exposure and things like that. But the main point is that based on the technologies we have developed over the past 8 to 9 years, once you have those samples, and we compare at the highest level, Brian, we compare the DNA of the people who got infected to the DNA, the genes of the people who did not get infected.
Wow.
We anticipate that the signal will be very, very strong based
so
on the.
and you will look for commonality of people, because, and I think also it's worth mentioning to folks that if you're looking at like some of your tests to find out where your dad was from or your mom was from, like it's a very small sample of DNA in a lot of cases. But if you look at the test that you're talking about, it's billions of letters, right? You're
That's
looking
right.
entirely through the entire biology, and then you're looking for commonality for those 5 or 6 people that maybe had mild symptoms. And is there something that's an anomaly against all of the other folks that caught it and maybe were severe, or vice versa?
That's exactly right. That's right. And most of the time, for example, when we look at things like heart disease and diabetes, actually the signals can be a little more subtle. Typically, and not always, but typically in these cases of these viral infection type situations, the signal is actually quite remarkable. And so the good news is that typically the stronger the signal, the less patients you need to study to find the signal. So that is why we are hoping that by studying a few hundred patients, we will be able to say very definitive conclusions about some of these differences. And then that's what we'll leverage for the testing.
Incredible. You must feel in some ways that this is your calling, like this incredible data research that you did over those years. Suddenly that has all come to call now. So what do you need? How can people help? And I mean everybody. Do you need investment? Do you need community to help? Do you need volunteers? What do you need, and how can people get engaged? Because I don't think there's a single person listening to this podcast who's not thinking, I want to help get this to the market as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, there's really 2 things, Brian, that we would need. One is we would need access to as many laboratories and testing centers as possible who are collecting samples. The more of these centers we work with, the faster we achieve the number of patients that we need to get to be able to find the signals. So first order of business, we need to get in touch with as many of these laboratories and testing centers as possible. Second, of course, is funding always. In order to get through that first 600 patients or so that we believe are going to be required for this first phase, that probably would be a $5 to $7 million investment. Of course, some of the work we are funding internally initially, that will take us so far. So of course, we will need to continue to work on funding to get to these answers.
Yeah. And the great thing about those particular people that you're going to do the full tests on, then it's not just for this one awful virus that's confronting us now. It can be used over and over again for everything. I mean, it kind of, in some way, it gets back, everything gets back to the very first thing that you said to me, even before we got to the podcast. Everybody on the planet should have an entire genomic testing so that we can tell as we're born or as our kids are born, what are the probability of just being susceptible to anything, right? And then we wouldn't need to deal with any of this crap that we're dealing with right now, because we would already have all of the data. The only thing that would need to happen is folks would need to analyze it.
Well, that's exactly right. And so remember when we first spoke, I gave you this analogy that what we do at the highest level is that we map out human biology. We map out life from DNA to all the molecules. And if you do that up front, which is what we had done, and you map out the entire territory, then once you find yourself in a dark valley, as we are now with this pandemic, then we can look around at that map and see where we are and which way we need to go.
I can't help feeling angry that we're in this place of incredible high technology where we're trying to find out how do we go to Mars and how do we go to space and how do we get flying damn cars that can bring our, our pizza over to us on a Friday evening. And nobody's being focused on the most important core component of our entire existence, which is how do we make sure that we're happy and healthy for the longest possible period in our lives? Like nobody's been looking at this. So maybe we can argue that people weren't sufficiently focused on it because we didn't have something like this happen. But I'm telling you, if we don't get to a place in a year, 2 years' time where entire countries are not testing every single child that's born and spending the money to make sure that they're preparing for the best, healthiest, and happiest life possible, I don't think there's an excuse for that.
Well, listen, I mean, if only we are taking this as this pandemic as an example. We had the first SARS crisis, then we had MERS, we had H1N1, and now we're in the second coronavirus pandemic. 4 very significant outbreaks within a span of 20 years. So we cannot fool ourselves, but to know that we will have another 2, 3, 4 of these in the next 15 to 20 years. So there's nothing more important than getting ready as a community, as a country, as countries to make this the standard that we map out every single person as they are born. So again, when these situations come up, and they will, then we are able to go back to that blueprint and say, aha, okay, so now we are dealing with coronavirus number 4. Now we can just look back at the map and say, you will be susceptible, you will not be susceptible, which is the same map we use to preempt Alzheimer's disease, the same map that we use to preempt cancer, diabetes, etc. This is why, Brian, we always talk about this triad of profiling, pinpointing, and preempting. That's what we need to do. It's not only applicable to those diseases like heart disease and diabetes, but also to viral infections like coronavirus, but many others. Remember, there's going to be many others that will come over the next 10 to 15 years. It's incredibly important we come together and develop that.
By the way, and probably worse, because this is kind of the first zombie apocalypse feeling that I've had. Like, there have been diseases, there have been infectious diseases, there have been terrible flus, there have been swine flu, there have been all kinds of stuff. But this is by far the most panic that's been spread around the globe in unison with people being sent into their own houses. And you kind of have to feel that it's not going to be the last one. You kind of feel, well, hold on. If this can do this, how many other ones are far worse out there that are waiting to come in 3, 5, 10, 15 years? So again, this podcast is not for folks to think, woe is us, this is terrible. There's actually wonderful things that actually come from terrible outbreaks. And one of the wonderful things that I really, really wanted to highlight on this podcast is the fact that, number one, if we can come up with a way to tell who is susceptible and who is not, and we can actually put our economy back to work again so that we can fight this properly, that is a wonderful thing. And actually, if we can put the right people in the right places so that the wrong people are not put at risk, that is a wonderful thing right now. And then number two, if we can use this awful situation to get into a place where we're actually going to be able to stop this from happening in the future by being able to profile ourselves properly so that we're protected from it, then we're in a better world.
Absolutely. And listen, precisely. And the goal here is not just this pandemic, not just this virus. The ultimate goal is for us to have longer, healthier, and happier lives. And with today's technologies, it is possible. We will get through this pandemic. We will continue to focus on this. We'll continue to focus on the other diseases. And we're working tirelessly to tie it all together for all of us to have a much brighter future.
Wonderful. Okay, so I want to finish off the podcast with a couple of things. Number one, I want to make sure again, everybody has your details. They have your email address, and they have any way that you want them to be able to contact you. Number 2, I want to make sure that we finish the podcast the way we begun, explaining really clearly the outcome that you want to have from this and the help that anybody can actually bring to it. Okay, Szilard, Dr. Voros, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So really, there's 2 things that we need. If you are working in a laboratory, you're working in a testing center, you're in any way or shape connected to any place where patients are being tested for coronavirus, please contact us so we can come to you, work with you to accelerate the sample collection. The second piece, that if you're aware of any funding mechanisms specifically dedicated to these efforts, also please let us know. We are funding some of it ourselves. But of course, this takes an enormous effort.
Wonderful. Okay. And then, so anybody contacting you can contact you at ba-boom?
The best one right now is to come either to our website, which is www.g3therapeutics.com, g3therapeutics.com, all one word, or through my email, which... Can we send that around some kind of way? It's probably not the easiest to...
Well, if we can put it here. I mean, either you can put it on the podcast, or folks can... I think it's good to have it on the podcast. Everybody can contact you directly.
I think that would be good. It's hard to spell it out, but it's probably... Is it some way? Can we put it up some way?
We'll put it on the podcast, and then on the website, folks can contact you as well, right?
That's correct.
It's true. It's a long name. And then look, so,
it is a long name.
Then also, I'm always here. This is something really important to me. Man, when I get a startup that has the ability to grow and scale and be huge, I love that. But when we have a startup that has the ability to actually save the world, there's nothing better. So this one's personal. So Brian at expertdojo.com, either contact me or contact Dr. Voros through the website. And remember, the importance of this is paramount and the speed of this is paramount. So we're going to make sure this podcast gets out there next week. Dr. Voros, thanks for joining us again. Good luck in all of the great work that you're doing, and be that person that I know you are, who's going to be the one who's going to help make this whole thing better.
Well, thank you, Brian, for having me. And I hope to be back with some great updates in the next few weeks.
Awesome. That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us. If you love the podcast, please empower your circle by sharing these stories. The Art of Startup War is brought to you by Expert Dojo. And remember, we invest in startups, $50,000 checks. Make sure you apply on our site if you are one of those great entrepreneurs looking to bring your company to the next level. As far as the Art of Startup War is concerned, we are back every single Tuesday at 10 a.m. So remember, check out the new episodes. If you want to find out what the investors think, check out season 1 or 2, but make sure you join us every single week.